Gloucester, Massachusetts is America's oldest seaport. For most of its 400-year history, Gloucester was the fishing capital of the world. Its lifeblood is dangerous and costly. More than 10,000 people have left this port and lost their lives in the Atlantic. When disaster strikes, few live to tell the tale. But one fisherman's story of survival at sea surpasses all others, and his ambition and daring made him a legend in Gloucester and one of the most celebrated seafarers in history. I'm Kory Curcuru for 1623 Studios, and this is the story of Howard Blackburn. Howard Blackburn's exhausted dory, listing badly and filled with water, limped to a stop upon the ice. Too proud to acknowledge his condition, Blackburn announced through gritted teeth that he would turn back to retrieve his dory mate. The stunned men pulled Howard ashore and bailed the vessel. 3 of the men pushed off to find Tom Welch. They asked Blackburn where to row. At the house down the river, he told them, in the tidal pool. The rescuers hadn't realized that Welch was dead. More people arrived at the water's edge. They were all members of the Lishman family and occupied a handful of shabby log cabins at Little River, now known as Grey River, a remote fishing settlement on the south coast of Newfoundland. It was instantly apparent that the Lishmans were terribly poor. A dozen children hopped on their bare feet to keep warm. They were joined by a pack of scrawny dogs. Those tending to Howard gave him a sense of place. The island Howard ignored because he thought it was uninhabited, Ramia, actually had a village on its opposite side. The first mainland he had spotted was Gulch Cove. If Howard hadn't chased the 2 schooners in open water in hopes of being sighted, he would have reached Cape Lahoon, a prosperous town with its own physician. Not exactly what Blackburn wanted to hear. Frank Lishman was the patriarch. He and his wife took Howard into their home. The floor was frozen dirt, the walls caked with mud, and a fireplace jutted through the roof. The family tub was a flour barrel. The beds were pallets of straw. Howard wondered if the situation he was in was better than what he just endured. Seeing the frostbite, the Lishmans cut away Howard's clothes and gave him tea with spruce boughs to drink, fearing water would kill him. They also offered hard bread. It was the first Howard had eaten in 114 hours. Mrs. Lishman soaked Howard's hands and feet in a saltwater brine, then bandaged him with flour paste and cod liver oil. The pain was agonizing. It was another sleepless night. The next morning, Mrs. Lishman changed the bandages, applying a powder of crushed mussel shells over the wounds. Howard's fingers, still curved from being frozen to the oars, started falling off. Gangrene set in. Each day, Mrs. Lishman cut off the blackened flesh while her daughter covered Howard's head with an apron to spare him the sight. They did this routine for weeks on end before new skin started to form. Howard lost all of his fingers, half of both thumbs, and 1 heel. Helpless for months, Blackburn sometimes went crazy and tried crawling on all 4s through the scrub brush to escape, only to be found and returned. Meanwhile, the desolate village of Little River was on the verge of starvation. The Lishmans survived on cod, flour, cornmeal, and melted snow. With the river frozen, the Newfoundland government in Burgeo was unable to send provisions. With supplies running out, the dogs were used for stew. Horrified, Howard choked down the broth and made sure the children ate the meat. A small group left Little River to beg the closest town for help, but all they brought back was bread damaged by kerosene. A reverend in Burgeo telegraphed the American consulate at St. John's, relaying the story of Howard Blackburn and the condition of the villagers nursing him to health. 6 months of provisions were sent, caravaned from one lonely outpost to the next before finally reaching Little River. It was the first time many of the Lishmans tasted real sugar or fresh milk. They consumed everything in days. News of Howard Blackburn's ordeal was chronicled around the world. A seal hunting steamer called the Nimrod was temporarily stuck in ice near Little River. The 30-man crew knew Howard's story and set out for the village to meet the seemingly mythical figure. When they saw the immobilized hero and the state of poverty in which the Lishmans lived, they left their lunches, returned to the steamer, and brought more provisions. It was the Lishman children who haunted Howard's mind. They couldn't read, so Blackburn did his best by reciting childhood stories or reading from the one book in the cabin, a ragged family Bible. Another month of monotony and pain passed. Spring arrived, and the ice began to break. The ground softened enough so Tom Welch could be buried in a simple grave in Burgeo. Howard was desperate to leave, even though he had no use of his hands or feet. It was April 22, 1883, when Blackburn insisted on going to Burgeo to begin the long process of returning to Gloucester. It had been 85 days since he landed at Little River. Despite their protestations, the Lishmans obliged. They carried Howard to a small dory so volunteers could row him away. He couldn't help but notice that of the 16 dogs who greeted him when he landed 3 months before, only one was left. As the Lishmans bid Howard farewell, Mrs. Lishman presented him with a small wooden box. Inside were all of his amputated fingers and toes. It was their tradition, she explained, that a person be buried with all of their body parts. Upon reaching Burgeo, Howard was taken to Tom Welch's grave. He left the wooden box with him. Blackburn stayed in a couple of homes for another month before a steamer took him 100 miles to St. Pierre, a small poor island off the Newfoundland coast controlled by the French. He started limping around without help. From there he took another steamer to Halifax and then to Boston, 133 days after the Grace L. Fears sailed to catch halibut. When Howard arrived at the train depot in Gloucester just before the start of summer, he was hailed a hero. Mobs of people cornered Howard wherever he went. The curious wanted to see him, and fishermen wanted to hear every detail. Blackburn was all too eager to share. He didn't have to pay for a drink or a meal anywhere. But Howard's disability brought him to a troubling crossroads. How could a fisherman survive without fingers or functioning feet? Yes, he was where he wanted to be, in the heart of the world's fishing industry. But how would he get by? The people of Gloucester stepped up. A candid interview with a local paper led to a campaign that raised $500 for Howard. He also got an $86 share from the Grace L. Fears, but only for the time he spent fishing before he disappeared. On October 16, 1883, Blackburn used the money to open a cigar and tobacco store on Main Street. On the same day, he became a naturalized citizen. Blackburn's shop featured 3 illustrations and a booklet of his ill-fated trip. Copies were available for purchase. Howard worked from open to close, 7 days a week, and it took a physical toll. The pain in his feet was so bad that he had his remaining toes amputated by Dr. Everett Garland, whose grandson Joe wrote the definitive novel of Blackburn's life, Lone Voyager, from which our story is based. There was only so much cash in cigars, so Howard hoped to turn Blackburn's into a true tavern, with liquor and salty food. But alcohol was a contentious topic. Gloucester voted annually to be wet or dry. Each year was a coin flip. When Gloucester went wet, Blackburn's prospered. When dry, Howard hid booze in back rooms and behind trap doors. This led to the occasional fine. It was worth it. At Christmas time in 1885, Howard, feeling deeply indebted to the people of Gloucester, donated $500 to fishermen's widows and fatherless children, a full repayment of the charity he received. Fishing was the most hazardous occupation in the world, and in the year of Howard's miraculous survival alone, Gloucester lost 17 vessels and 209 men to the sea. After a short courtship, Blackburn, becoming bigger than life by the day, married a quiet dressmaker, Teresa Lally. They lived a few doors down from the business and had a child, Howard Jr. Then tragedy struck again. At only 6 weeks of age, Jr. caught a cold. Howard and Teresa's visiting nurse accidentally overmedicated the baby, who died. Teresa never told her hothead husband the truth, and he held the baby's death against her. A subsequent surgery for Teresa prevented her from ever having another child. By now, Howard's bank account matched his appetite for life. He bought the property around his store, which at that time sat upon Gloucester's inner harbor before the waterfront was industrialized. He hobnobbed with the likes of heavyweight prizefighter John L. Sullivan. He was also incredibly charitable. Howard always carried wads of cash and never said no to a handout. He anonymously had food and coal delivered to households throughout the city. And he stowed away a penny from each sale at the bar for an annual donation to the newly developed Addison Gilbert Hospital. Equally important to Howard was his support of the Lishman family who saved his life. Blackburn constantly paid heavy freight fees to herring boats to alter their course and deliver clothes and food. He redoubled his efforts upon learning that one of the young Lishman children was lost at sea while fishing with Father Frank. After returning to Little River, an inconsolable Frank wandered into the woods and shot himself. When Gloucester voted dry at the end of 1895, Howard rented his tavern to a friend and traveled west, partly for adventure and partly to seek relief from his crippling arthritis. At one point, he ended up on a dude ranch in Hot Springs, Arkansas. During this time, he dreamt of further exploring the country, but he also caught wind about a not-too-distant phenomenon that was gripping the nation again: gold. Men, simple men of modest means, were making unthinkable fortunes in the Great Northwest, just as they had in San Francisco a few decades before. Newspaper headlines around the world glorified tale after tale of treasure hunters striking it rich. Howard's eyes grew wide. The enterprising Blackburn figured that with his acumen, fortitude, business sense, and experience, he could lead a successful expedition to the land of riches. When Howard returned to Gloucester, he put a plan in place.